My $12,000 wedding dress is currently wiping blood off a marble floor. 32 hours ago, I was a project manager who caught her sister sleeping with her fiance in a bridal suite. Now I stand before a man who can silence Seattle with a single gesture. My plan was just to drink away the betrayal. I never expected the marriage certificate resting on the table to become the sharpest weapon I have ever owned. Hello, everyone. Before today's story begins, we'd like to share a quick message. YouTube recently removed our monetization, cutting off our income. If you enjoy this story, we humbly ask for just $1 to help pay our staff so they can make a living and keep creating for you. Thank you for saving us. Now, let's begin the story. My name is Morgan Allen. I am a 35-year-old project manager who built a career on predicting risks, analyzing data, and mitigating disasters long before they happen. Yet, I completely failed to see the catastrophic betrayal brewing inside my own home. The afternoon air in downtown Seattle was unseasonably crisp when I arrived at the exclusive bridal boutique. I was exactly 2 hours early for my final dress fitting. A major client meeting had wrapped up ahead of schedule, clearing up my afternoon, and I thought surprising my fiancé, Julian, would be a romantic gesture. He had insisted on arriving early to handle the final payment and arrangements for my $12,000 gown. I walked through the heavy glass doors, greeting the boutique manager who gave me a warm, albeit slightly confused, smile. She told me Julian was already in the VIP suite waiting for me. I walked down the hushed, velvet-lined corridor. The boutique was famously quiet, specifically designed to give their elite clients an atmosphere of total privacy. But as I approached the heavy oak door of the VIP suite, that expensive silence was broken. I heard muffled sounds, heavy, strained breathing, a soft, rhythmic thud vibrating against the wood paneling. I stopped dead in my tracks. A bitter smile tugged at the corner of my lips as my brain, ever the analytical machine, began processing the incoming data. Sitting abandoned on the plush sofa just outside the suite was a limited edition leather handbag. I recognized it instantly. It belonged to my younger sister, Chloe. I had bought it for her 25th birthday just last month. My hand rested on the polished brass doorknob. I did not hesitate. I pushed the door wide open. The scene inside was a grotesque mockery of everything I had planned for my future. The $12,000 cascade of imported silk and French lace that I was supposed to wear down the aisle was spread out across the pristine carpet, serving as a makeshift blanket. And writhing on top of my ruined wedding dress were Julian and Chloe. They were so intensely entangled, so utterly consumed by their secret affair, that they did not even register the heavy door swinging open. I stood there bathed in the soft, flattering light meant to make brides look angelic. I felt no heartbreak. I felt no urge to scream, throw things, or tear my hair out. Any warmth or love I had for the man on the floor evaporated in a single heartbeat, replaced by a freezing, absolute clarity. Not a single tear formed in my eyes. Crying was a reaction reserved for victims, and I absolutely refused to be a victim, moving with the calm precision of a machine. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out my phone. I raised the device, framing the shot perfectly. I captured their faces, the unmistakable pattern of the dress beneath them, and the undeniable, naked reality of their betrayal. The shutter sound was completely silent. The high-resolution photograph was saved to my secure cloud storage instantly. This was no longer a relationship. It was a breach of contract, and I had just secured the ultimate piece of evidence. Without uttering a single word to the two people disgracing themselves on the floor, I turned around and walked out. I pulled the heavy oak door shut behind me with a soft click, leaving them sealed in their filthy little world. I walked out of the boutique, the crisp Seattle air hitting my face once more. I slipped the 3-carat diamond engagement ring off my finger. The stone suddenly felt heavy, tacky, and utterly worthless. As I passed a wrought iron public trash bin on the corner of the street, I tossed the ring inside without breaking my stride. I did not look back. I hailed a passing yellow taxi. The driver looked at me through the rearview mirror. "Where to, miss?" "Take me to the Grand Sovereign Hotel downtown. I replied. I leaned back against the worn leather seat, staring out at the blurred city lights, systematically formulating my next moves. When I arrived at the Grand Hotel, I walked straight to the concierge. "I need your presidential suite for the night," I stated, sliding my platinum credit card across the polished marble counter. "Right away, madam," the receptionist replied, processing the transaction with swift professionalism. Once I had the heavy key card in my hand, I did not take the elevator up to the penthouse. Instead, I turned on my heel and descended the grand staircase leading down to the underground lounge. The basement bar was wrapped in shadows, thick with the scent of expensive bourbon and cedar. It was the perfect place to disappear. I walked over to the darkest corner, slid into an isolated leather booth, and ordered the strongest liquor they had on the shelf. I needed the violent, burning sensation of the alcohol to numb the residual shock vibrating through my veins. I sat completely alone in the dim light, nursing my glass, entirely unaware that my night was about to violently shift from a domestic tragedy into a terrifying matter of life and death. The underground lounge of the Grand Hotel was suffocatingly quiet. I had consumed exactly 2 glasses of their most expensive bourbon, hoping the fiery liquid would grant me some form of temporary amnesia. The bartender had vanished into the back room 15 minutes ago, leaving the dimly lit space almost entirely deserted. Only 2 people remained in the cavernous room. I sat isolated in a curved leather booth, staring blankly at the ice melting in my glass. Across the room, occupying a table in the farthest and darkest corner, was a solitary figure. He wore a bespoke black suit that seemed to absorb the dim ambient light. His posture was perfectly rigid, his face an unreadable mask of cold indifference. He exuded an unnatural stillness, like a predator patiently waiting in the shadows. I did not know it at that moment, but this man was Silas Vance. He was not a wealthy businessman unwinding after a long corporate day. He was the reigning apex predator of the city underground, a crime boss currently being hunted by a heavily armed rival syndicate from the East Coast. I took another slow sip of my drink, the alcohol doing absolutely nothing to dull the sharp edges of my reality. Suddenly, the heavy mahogany doors of the lounge splintered inward with a deafening crash. Chaos erupted in a fraction of a second. 4 men dressed in dark tactical gear swarmed into the elegant room. They carried automatic weapons and moved with lethal, military precision. They did not shout any warnings. They did not demand money. They simply raised their guns and opened fire directly at the dark corner. The deafening roar of relentless gunfire shattered the expensive silence of the hotel. Glass fixtures exploded overhead, raining down in sharp, glittering pieces. Dozens of liquor bottles behind the bar burst into fountains of amber fluid, filling the air with the overwhelming stench of raw alcohol and burning cordite. My survival instincts took over instantly. I threw myself onto the sticky floor, covering my head with my arms as bullets tore through the expensive leather seating. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through my alcohol-induced haze. I scrambled blindly on my hands and knees under the heavy wooden tables, desperate to find an exit. Amidst the relentless destruction, I saw the man in the bespoke suit move. Silas Vance did not panic. He moved with terrifying, calculated violence. He drew a weapon from inside his tailored jacket and returned fire, dropping the first 2 attackers with ruthless, effortless precision. I needed to get out before I became collateral damage. My breathing was ragged, my hands shaking violently as I crawled toward the service hallway doors. In the darkness, my hand brushed against smooth, cold leather resting under a fallen chair. In my panicked and disoriented state, my brain registered it as my own designer tote. I grabbed the heavy bag tightly and pulled it against my chest. I had absolutely no idea that I had just taken possession of the encrypted hard drive belonging to Silas Vance, a physical device containing the entire financial infrastructure of his criminal empire. Before I could move another inch, a strong, unyielding hand clamped down on my wrist like a steel vice. I gasped, looking up into a pair of eyes as cold and gray as a winter storm. It was Silas. He glanced down at the black bag clutched in my arms. then looked back at the remaining heavily armed men running into the ruined lounge. "Get up," he commanded. His voice was deep and entirely devoid of fear. "Run!" He hauled me to my feet with effortless strength. He shoved me toward the kitchen doors, providing cover fire as we sprinted through the swinging metallic panels. We tore through the chaotic hotel kitchen, slipping on spilled grease and dodging panicked culinary staff who had dropped to the floor. The terrifying sounds of heavy combat boots echoing behind us signaled that the assassins were closing the distance. Silas kicked open the reinforced steel back door, and we burst out into the damp, freezing alleyway. The sudden blast of cold night air hit my lungs like shattered glass. We raced down the narrow passage, our hurried footsteps echoing loudly against the damp brick walls. But just as we reached the end of the alley, a screeching black utility vehicle violently blocked our path. We stopped abruptly, trapped directly under the harsh glare of a flickering street lamp. A man leaned out of the vehicle window, leveling a weapon right at us. Before he could pull the trigger, Silas fired twice, eliminating the threat instantly. However, the damage was already done. In those 5 agonizing seconds standing under that bright yellow light, the remaining attackers rounding the corner got a perfectly clear, unobstructed view of my face. Time seemed to freeze as their eyes locked directly onto mine. They recognized my features perfectly. They saw me running alongside Silas Vance, tightly clutching his most prized possession. "They saw you," Silas stated, his tone turning dangerously grim. He grabbed my arm again and dragged me toward a sleek, armored sedan waiting at the opposite end of the intersecting street. "Get in." The massive engine roared to life before my passenger door was even completely shut. The driver tore through the city streets at breakneck speed, performing violent, evasive maneuvers for 30 minutes until we finally lost our pursuers in the endless maze of the industrial district. My heart hammered wildly against my ribs. I stared down at the heavy black leather bag in my lap, finally realizing the horrifying mistake I had made. It was not my purse. The armored vehicle eventually pulled into a heavily fortified subterranean garage. Silas escorted me out of the car and guided me through 3 layers of biometric security doors into a sprawling, high-tech safe house. The sheer scale and militaristic nature of the operation confirmed my absolute worst fears. I was completely trapped in a world I did not understand. Silas walked over to a polished steel counter. He poured a glass of water and handed it to me. He stood leaning against the metal surface, studying me with an intense, calculating gaze that made me feel entirely transparent. "Those men belong to the East Coast Syndicate," he explained, his voice low, steady, and terrifyingly calm. "They have been tracking my movements for 6 months, and now, thanks to that street lamp in the alley, they have your face. By tomorrow morning, they will know your full name, your home address, your workplace, and every single detail about your life. You are a civilian holding my encrypted data. To them, you are a loose end. They will absolutely kill you." A wave of cold dread washed over me. It was a terror far worse and far more immediate than the pathetic betrayal I had witnessed earlier that afternoon. My corporate logic desperately searched for a solution, a legal loophole, any kind of negotiation tactic. "I will go to the police," I countered, my voice tight. "I will enter the federal witness protection program." Silas let out a harsh, humorless laugh. "The police cannot stop them. Witness protection is a bureaucratic illusion. My enemies have people inside every single law enforcement agency in this city. If you walk into a police precinct, you will be dead within 48 hours. "Then what is the solution?" I demanded. My voice trembled slightly despite my absolute best efforts to keep it steady. "I am not dying for a gang war I know nothing about." Silas stepped closer. His imposing figure towered over me, making the temperature in the room feel as though it had instantly dropped. "There is exactly one way you survive this night," he said, enunciating every single word with chilling precision. "The Vance family operates under a strict, ancient code. We protect our own blood with the full, devastating force of our entire organization. If you are just a civilian, you are nothing but collateral damage. But if you belong to the family, touching you means declaring an all-out war that they know they cannot win. He reached into his tailored jacket pocket and pulled out a sleek silver pen. He placed it carefully on the glass table next to a thick stack of legal documents that his associates had just brought into the room. "You will marry me," Silas declared. His gray eyes locked onto mine with absolute, uncompromising authority. "You become my legal wife. You take the Vance name. That is the only choice you have left if you want to stay alive." The sleek digital clock on the wall of the safe house read exactly 3 o'clock in the morning when the personal attorney for Silas arrived. He was a sharply dressed man carrying a heavy leather briefcase that contained my entirely new reality. He placed the marriage documents on the glass table, sliding a heavy gold fountain pen toward me. I stared at the thick stack of papers. My analytical mind, usually so heavily reliant on risk assessments and corporate strategy, immediately recognized the stark truth of my situation. I was backed into a corner with absolutely zero leverage regarding my physical safety. The East Coast Syndicate was a variable I could not control. However, I absolutely refused to be a passive participant in my own life, if I was going to bind myself to the apex predator of the Seattle underground. I was going to extract my own pound of flesh in return. I picked up the heavy gold pen, but I did not sign. I looked up and met the cold, calculating gaze of Silas. "I will sign this contract and take your name," I stated, my voice steady and completely devoid of the fear I had felt in the alleyway. "I will play the role of your devoted wife, but I have one non-negotiable condition. I need full access to your network, your intelligence gatherers, and your resources. I am going to utterly annihilate the career of Julian, and you are going to facilitate it." A profound silence filled the room. The attorney looked at Silas nervously. Silas simply stared at me for a long, heavy moment. Then, the faintest hint of an approving smile touched the corners of his mouth. It was the look of a man who had expected a terrified victim and instead found a willing accomplice. "You have my vast resources at your complete disposal," Silas replied smoothly. "Burn his life to the ground." I uncapped the pen and signed my name on the dotted line. With those few strokes of ink, the frightened woman who had fled the bridal boutique ceased to exist. I was instantly transformed. I had traded my domestic illusions for a terrifying, undeniable power. At exactly 9 o'clock the next morning, I returned to the luxury penthouse apartment I had shared with Julian. I did not return alone. Walking behind me were 4 imposing men dressed in immaculate black suits. They were highly trained enforcers, moving with a silent, disciplined lethality that commanded immediate submission. I unlocked the front door and pushed it open. The apartment smelled of stale wine and bad decisions. Julian and Chloe were sitting at the kitchen island, looking thoroughly exhausted and pathetic. When they heard the door, their heads snapped up. The color drained completely from the face of Julian as he took in the sight of the 4 giant men flanking me. "What is going on?" Julian stammered, standing up so quickly his bar stool scraped loudly against the hardwood floor. Chloe shrank back against the marble counter, clutching her silk robe tightly around her chest. "We made a terrible mistake," Chloe whined, taking a tentative step forward. "It was just a stupid, meaningless moment of weakness. You have to believe us. Please do not overreact." I did not even afford her the dignity of a glance. Looking at them felt like looking at 2 insignificant insects. My emotional detachment was absolute. "Clear it out," I commanded, projecting my voice to the 4 men behind me. "Pack every single piece of clothing, all the jewelry, and the personal electronics that belong to me. Then, call the moving crew. I want the custom Italian leather sofa I purchased, the imported espresso machine, the antique dining table, and the smart home theater system dismantled and removed. If I paid for it, it leaves this apartment today." The bodyguards moved instantly, sweeping through the apartment with terrifying efficiency. Julian watched in mounting horror as his luxurious lifestyle was systematically dismantled right in front of his eyes. His initial shock rapidly gave way to a desperate, panicked anger. His fragile ego could not handle the humiliation of being stripped bare in his own home. "You cannot just barge in here and take the furniture," Julian yelled, his face flushing bright red. He marched toward the lead bodyguard, who was currently unplugging the massive television screen. "Put that down right now. Get out of my house." Julian foolishly reached out and violently shoved the broad shoulder of the enforcer. The bodyguard did not even flinch. He simply turned his head, looking at Julian with dead, empty eyes, silently calculating the exact amount of force required to snap his neck. Before the bodyguard could react, the front door swung open wider. The temperature in the room plummeted. Silas Vance stepped over the threshold, his dark overcoat sweeping against the doorframe. He did not say a single word. He simply locked his freezing gray eyes onto Julian. The sheer, overwhelming aura of violence radiating from Silas hit Julian like a physical blow. Julian gasped, his eyes widening in pure, unadulterated terror. He scrambled backward, his feet tangling in the heavy living room rug. He lost his balance completely and crashed hard onto the floor, scrambling pathetically like a frightened child trying to escape a monster. I looked down at Julian groveling on the floor, and a cold, satisfied smile spread across my face. I adjusted my designer coat and turned toward the door. "Enjoy the empty apartment, Julian," I said, my tone dripping with absolute ice. "And make sure you check your corporate email thoroughly tomorrow morning. Vanguard Metrics is going to receive a massive, unforgettable surprise." I walked out into the hallway, leaving the ruins of my old life behind, flanked by my new husband and an empire of shadows. Immediately after leaving my stripped apartment, I returned to the heavily fortified Vance estate and locked myself inside their subterranean server room. I had already spent the entire previous night utilizing the terrifyingly advanced cyber warfare tools provided by the intelligence division of my new husband to launch a silent, devastating invasion into the private corporate network of Vanguard Metrics. Now, it was time to perfectly organize the kill shot. I had practically built that technology firm from the ground up alongside Julian. I wrote the initial business models, structured their complex risk management protocols, and personally secured their first major round of seed funding, because I knew the architectural blueprint of their entire financial system. Bypassing their recently upgraded security firewalls took me less than 15 minutes. What I discovered, hidden deep inside the encrypted executive ledgers, was almost insulting to my intelligence. Julian was not an evil, sophisticated mastermind. He was just a greedy, remarkably sloppy thief. He had been systematically siphoning corporate capital through a convoluted web of ghost vendors, artificially inflating operational expenses for their new software development branch by exactly 45% over the course of 18 months. He had successfully diverted $2,500,000 into a heavily shielded offshore bank account located in the Cayman Islands. I meticulously compiled every single fraudulent wire transfer, every forged digital invoice, and every hidden email chain into a devastatingly organized, undeniable dossier of financial treason. I had absolutely no desire to stage a dramatic public confrontation or throw a screaming fit like a jealous, scorned woman. True revenge is best served with cold, absolute corporate precision. I drafted a highly secure, completely untraceable email and attached the massive encrypted file. With one deliberate strike of the Enter key, I scheduled the entire package to be delivered directly to the personal inboxes of the board of directors and the 5 largest venture capital investors at exactly 6 o'clock the following morning. Silas stood leaning against the heavy steel doorframe of the server room, silently sipping a glass of dark whiskey. He watched the harsh blue light of the multiple computer monitors reflect on my face. He did not see a broken, terrified civilian crying over a shattered relationship. He saw a ruthlessly efficient, highly analytical weapon. My complete lack of mercy and my surgical precision intrigued him immensely. 2 days later, Silas decided to test my capabilities outside the digital realm. He brought me along to a highly volatile negotiation at a private, heavily guarded warehouse near the city docks. A prominent local shipping union boss was attempting to extort the Vance organization, violently demanding a 25% increase in protection tariffs to allow their cargo containers to move freely through the port. The union boss sat across a rusted metal table, surrounded by heavily armed thugs, speaking with arrogant, misplaced confidence. Silas remained perfectly silent, radiating pure physical menace. While I calmly unlatched my leather briefcase, I did not use threats of physical violence. I simply slid a thick red folder across the table. I had spent the entire morning analyzing the public and private ledgers of the union. I looked directly into the eyes of the corrupt boss and systematically explained how I had easily uncovered his massive commercial real estate money laundering scheme. I told him that if he did not lower his current tariff rates by 10%, those unredacted financial documents would accidentally fall into the hands of the federal tax authorities by midnight. The arrogant man turned pale, his confidence shattering instantly. He signed the new agreement with visibly trembling hands. Silas looked at me as we walked back to our armored car, a dark, genuine smirk playing on his lips. I was no longer just a protected asset. I was actively expanding his empire. Meanwhile, the digital bomb I had detonated at Vanguard Metrics destroyed the life of Julian completely. The fallout was magnificent. At exactly 9 o'clock that morning, Julian was dragged out of a high-level executive meeting by 4 armed private security officers. He was publicly terminated, stripped of all his corporate equity, and permanently banned from the premises. By noon, federal investigators had frozen his personal bank accounts and seized his luxury vehicles. He was facing a massive corporate civil lawsuit and almost certain federal prison time for embezzling millions of dollars. His entire professional identity was vaporized before lunchtime. But a ruined career was only half of the equation. I needed to ensure Chloe suffered equally. I accessed the master digital spreadsheet containing the contact information for the 350 guests invited to our upcoming wedding. Aunts, uncles, college friends, former professors, and influential family business associates. I created a mass multimedia message containing the high-resolution photograph I had taken in the VIP bridal suite. I added absolutely no text. No explanation was necessary. The vivid, undeniable image of Chloe violently entangled with my fiancé on top of my ruined silk gown spoke perfectly for itself. I pressed send and watched the delivery confirmations roll across the screen. The social execution was absolute and instantaneous. Within 1 hour, the mother of Chloe called her screaming hysterically. By the late afternoon, she was completely ostracized from our entire extended family. Her lifelong friends deleted her numbers, and her professional network severed all ties immediately. She was utterly exiled, permanently trapped in a prison of pure, inescapable public humiliation. Late that evening, my secure burner phone buzzed loudly on the mahogany desk. It was an unrecognized number. I answered the call and placed the device on speakerphone. Julian was hyperventilating on the other end, his voice cracking with pure, unadulterated panic. "Morgan, please, you have to stop this. I have absolutely nothing left. The board took everything. The federal authorities are waiting outside my apartment building. How could you be this incredibly cruel? I am begging you, please forgive me." I listened to his pathetic, agonizing sobs for exactly 60 seconds, savoring the beautiful melodic symphony of his total destruction. I felt absolutely nothing but pure, triumphant satisfaction. I leaned close to the microphone and spoke with freezing, absolute calm. "Happy early birthday, Julian." Without waiting for his desperate response, I pressed the red button and permanently disconnected the line. The East Coast Syndicate had absolutely no intention of abandoning their hunt. They were desperate rats, scurrying through the ruins of the life I had recently destroyed. During their frantic search for any leverage against the Vance organization, they stumbled upon the pathetic, shattered remnants of Julian. He was currently hiding in a cheap motel on the outskirts of the city, facing federal prison, drowning in insurmountable legal fees, and utterly destitute. When a syndicate operative wearing a sharp suit knocked on his peeling door and offered him $2 million in untraceable cash, Julian did not hesitate for a single second. His overwhelming greed and his desperate, pathetic craving for his lost luxury completely blinded him to the lethal danger he was inviting. He had memorized my digital corporate calendar before his executive access was permanently revoked. Knowing the exact timing and location of my quarterly strategic meetings with our clean subsidiaries, he gladly traded my life for a briefcase full of dirty money, foolishly hoping to buy his way back into the elite society that had violently rejected him. It happened on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. I was being driven to a high-level corporate acquisition meeting in the financial district. The city was draped in a heavy, suffocating gray fog. My driver, a seasoned Vance enforcer named Marcus, navigated the slick, narrow streets with practiced caution. We were riding inside a heavily reinforced, customized luxury sport utility vehicle. I was calmly reviewing a complicated earnings report on my tablet when my entire world suddenly exploded into chaos. A massive commercial garbage truck violently ran a red light and slammed directly into the passenger side of our vehicle. The impact was deafening. I was thrown violently against the reinforced door, the tablet flying out of my hands. The heavy armored vehicle was pushed brutally right across 2 lanes of oncoming traffic, its tires screeching against the wet asphalt until we were violently pinned against a solid concrete barrier. Before Marcus could even unholster his weapon, 5 masked men armed with high-caliber assault rifles surrounded our crippled vehicle. They opened fire simultaneously. The sound was a terrifying, continuous roar of destruction. The heavy ballistic glass spider-webbed instantly, glowing a bright, terrifying white under the relentless impact of dozens of armor-piercing rounds. The reinforced steel plating of the doors screamed as the kinetic energy struck it repeatedly. I ducked down instantly, covering my head with my arms, the acrid, burning smell of cordite filling the confined space. The heavy armored shell of the vehicle was barely holding, but I knew it was only a matter of minutes before they breached the weakened glass and executed us both. Suddenly, the deafening roar of the assault rifles was interrupted by the terrifying, high-pitched scream of high-performance engines. 3 pitch-black tactical vehicles tore blindly around the corner, ignoring traffic laws entirely. Silas had arrived. The doors of his heavy vehicles burst open before they even came to a complete stop. What followed was not a shootout. It was a highly coordinated, merciless slaughter. Silas led the charge himself. The cold, calculated businessman I had seen operating in the server room was entirely gone. In his place was a terrifying creature of absolute, unrestrained violence. He moved through the chaotic crossfire with a lethal, terrifying grace, dropping the attackers with precise, devastating shots. The ambush was completely neutralized in exactly 45 seconds. The heavy, dented door of my ruined vehicle was violently wrenched open. Silas stood there, his chest heaving heavily, his expensive dark suit dusted with gray ash and shattered glass. His cold gray eyes frantically scanned my body, searching for fatal wounds. I reached up slowly to push my tangled hair out of my face, and that was when he saw it. A jagged, sharp piece of the interior paneling had shattered during the initial brutal impact, slicing a deep, bleeding gash right across my left forearm. The bright red blood was rapidly soaking through the delicate sleeve of my white silk blouse, dripping steadily onto the dark leather seat. The exact moment Silas saw the bright red stain, the remaining color drained completely from his face. His famously calm demeanor shattered into a million jagged pieces. He let out a low, terrifying snarl. Gripping the heavy steel doorframe so hard, his knuckles turned completely white. He looked as though he was ready to resurrect the dead men bleeding out on the wet asphalt, just to kill them a second time. He gently pulled me out of the smoking wreckage, wrapping his heavy dark overcoat tightly around my trembling shoulders. We were rushed immediately to a secure, heavily guarded underground medical facility operated exclusively by his organization. A trauma surgeon was standing by, but Silas violently waved him off. He ordered every single person out of the sterile room. I sat quietly on the edge of the cold steel examination table, trembling slightly from the rapidly fading adrenaline. Silas pulled up a rolling metal stool and sat directly in front of me. He opened a heavy metallic first aid kit. His large hands, which had just delivered death with absolute certainty on the street, were surprisingly gentle as he carefully rolled up my ruined silk sleeve. He cleaned the deep cut with strong antiseptic, his jaw clenched so incredibly tight, a muscle ticked furiously in his cheek. I looked down at him, and everything shifted. The protective, purely transactional barrier between us had completely dissolved in the gunfire. The marriage contract resting securely in his vault was supposed to be a purely legal shield to keep me breathing. But as I watched his dark eyes narrow with raw, undeniable anguish over a simple cut on my arm, the truth hit me with the force of a physical blow. He actually cared. He cared deeply and dangerously. This terrifying lord of the criminal underworld was silently agonizing over my physical pain. This fake marriage had morphed into something intensely real, permanently anchored in blood and survival. He carefully wrapped a pristine white linen bandage around my arm, securing it with precise, deliberate movements. "It was Julian," Silas finally said, his voice dropping to a deadly, vibrating whisper. "My intelligence network intercepted the offshore wire transfer 10 minutes ago. The East Coast Syndicate paid him a massive fortune to leak your schedule. I am going to have my men drag him out of his miserable little hotel room tonight. I am going to personally peel the flesh directly from his bones." The sheer, unfiltered hatred in his voice sent a freezing shiver straight down my spine. But my analytical mind instantly engaged. A quick, violent execution in a dirty motel room was far too merciful for a pathetic traitor like Julian. He had actively tried to have me murdered just to reclaim his pathetic, shallow lifestyle. "No," I said softly, reaching out and resting my uninjured hand gently over his clenched fist. Silas snapped his head up instantly, his gray eyes blazing with pure fury at my unexpected refusal. "Do not kill him," I continued, my voice perfectly steady. "Not quickly in the dark. Death is far too easy for a man who values money and status above his own soul." I leaned forward, looking directly into the eyes of the most dangerous man in Seattle. "Let me handle this," I commanded quietly. "As your actual wife, I want to use the full, terrifying weight of this criminal empire to push him blindly into a trap of his own making. I want him to eagerly sign his own death warrant, completely believing he has finally won the game." Silas stared at me for a long time. Slowly, the murderous, chaotic rage faded from his eyes, replaced entirely by a dark, consuming, and deeply terrifying admiration. He slowly turned his hand over, intertwining his strong fingers perfectly with mine. "Tell me your plan," he whispered. Exactly 6 weeks after the failed ambush on the wet streets of the financial district, the Grand Sovereign Hotel hosted the most exclusive charity gala of the decade. This was the exact location where my chaotic descent into the criminal underworld had begun. Tonight, however, the grand ballroom was completely transformed into a blinding display of wealth and absolute power. Crystal chandeliers cast a golden glow over hundreds of the most influential politicians, corporate titans, and silent crime lords in the city. They were all gathered under one roof, mingling seamlessly. I stood near the grand staircase, wearing a custom-tailored midnight black evening gown that swept elegantly across the polished marble floor. It was a deliberate, striking contrast to the ruined $12,000 white silk dress from my past life. Silas stood securely by my side, radiating a dark, magnetic authority in his impeccable tuxedo. The heavy brass doors of the ballroom opened, and Julian walked inside. He looked entirely out of place. His rented suit was poorly fitted, and his face was pale, glistening with a thick layer of nervous sweat. He was not here to enjoy the champagne. He was here as a desperate, terrified pawn. My intelligence division had intercepted his communications 3 days ago, facing a 30-year federal prison sentence for embezzlement. Julian had cowardly struck a covert plea deal with the authorities. He was currently wearing a hidden recording device taped directly to his chest, foolishly hoping to bait Silas into confessing his illegal operations on tape in exchange for full governmental immunity. He scanned the crowded room, his eyes darting frantically until they locked onto me. He took a hesitant step forward, entirely unaware that he was walking straight into the jaws of a flawlessly engineered trap. I gracefully tapped my crystal champagne flute with a silver spoon. The sharp, clear sound pierced the ambient noise of the ballroom, instantly silencing the elite crowd. I walked slowly up the carpeted steps to the main stage, adjusting the microphone stand with complete composure. "Good evening, ladies and gentlemen," I began, my voice echoing clearly across the vast room. "Thank you all for attending tonight. Charity is about providing salvation to those in desperate need, and recently, I found myself in a unique position to offer a very specific kind of salvation to a man standing among us right now." I looked directly at Julian. The spotlight shifted, illuminating his terrified, sweating face for the entire city elite to see. "Julian," I said smoothly, letting his name hang in the heavy air, "I know you have been struggling with a massive mountain of corporate litigation and federal restitution. I decided to intervene yesterday afternoon. My legal team officially purchased every single one of your financial liabilities. I bought the $2,500,000 corporate debt from Vanguard Metrics. I acquired the liens on your seized properties. I now completely own your financial existence." Julian stared at me, his jaw dropping in pure, uncomprehending shock. "You are no longer facing federal prison," I continued, offering him a perfectly cold, merciless smile, "because you are going to spend the rest of your natural life working directly for my subsidiary shell companies to pay off your massive debt. You will work exactly 80 hours a week, with 0 vacation days, and your wages will be entirely garnished until the day you die. You belong to me now." Panic violently seized him. He instinctively reached his hand toward his chest, desperately pressing the hidden transmitter beneath his shirt, praying his federal handlers were recording this public extortion. Silas detached himself from the shadows and walked slowly down the steps until he stood right in front of Julian. The entire ballroom held its collective breath. Silas reached into his tuxedo pocket, pulled out a sleek digital audio player, and pressed a single button. The device began to play crystal-clear audio. It was the exact sound of heavy breathing, the rustling of fabric, and the frantic heartbeat of Julian. It was the live feed from his own hidden wire. "Your government friends are not listening. Julian," Silas whispered softly, his voice carrying just enough for the surrounding guests to hear. "My technicians hijacked their radio frequencies 2 hours ago. No one is coming to save you. You are completely alone." The realization hit Julian with the devastating force of a freight train. His knees buckled instantly, and he collapsed onto the luxurious carpet, sobbing uncontrollably in front of the most powerful people in the state. Suddenly, a shrill, hysterical voice shattered the elegant atmosphere. "Julian, get up! Morgan, you cannot do this to him! He is family!" Chloe burst through the security checkpoint at the rear entrance. She looked completely unhinged. Her hair was heavily tangled, her makeup was smeared down her cheeks, and she was wearing a cheap, wrinkled cocktail dress. She charged wildly toward the stage, screaming obscenities, desperately trying to salvage the broken man on the floor. I did not even blink. I simply offered a brief nod to the head of security. Before Chloe could even reach the center of the room, 4 massive guards intercepted her. They did not speak. They grabbed her arms with brutal efficiency. Lifting her feet completely off the ground, she kicked and screamed wildly, throwing a pathetic, childish tantrum, but it was entirely useless. They carried her out of the grand ballroom as the wealthy guests watched with expressions of absolute disgust and pity. The heavy doors slammed shut, silencing her pathetic cries forever. The room quickly returned to its sophisticated murmur as waiters smoothly resumed pouring expensive champagne. The trash had been thoroughly removed. Later that night, the gala concluded. I stood on the private marble balcony of the penthouse suite, letting the freezing Seattle wind wash over my face. The glittering city lights stretched out endlessly below me like a massive ocean of diamonds. I heard the soft click of the glass door opening behind me. Silas stepped out into the cold night air and gently draped his heavy, warm coat over my bare shoulders. He wrapped his strong arms around my waist, pulling me firmly against his chest. I leaned back into his embrace, looking down at the streets that used to terrify me. I was no longer the naive project manager weeping over a ruined $12,000 dress. I was no longer a victim of cheap domestic betrayal. I had forged my own terrifying destiny in the fires of vengeance, and now I stood ruling the shadows as a queen directly beside the most dangerous man in the city. Thank you so much for listening to today's story. We hope you enjoyed it. As an ad-free channel, your support is what keeps us alive. Please support Violet Revenge Stories with just $1 via the QR code on the screen, or click the link in the description box or pinned comment. Also, we'd love to connect with you. Please leave a comment telling us which city or state you're listening from. Thank you for standing with us, and see you in the next stories.